At a certain point in life, a person can lose themselves without anything visibly falling apart. The calendar still fills. The emails still receive answers. The face in the mirror still knows how to behave. From the outside, the life may even look successful. But privately, something has gone missing. The old ambitions no longer persuade. The old identity feels too small. The achievements that once promised arrival now feel like furniture in a room where no one lives. And the person begins to ask a frightening question. If I am still functioning, why do I feel as if the center has disappeared? Edward F. Edinger spent much of his work circling that question. He was a psychiatrist, a Jungian analyst, and one of the clearest American interpreters of Jung. But his importance is not simply that he explained Jung well. His importance is that he gave many people a map for the moment when the ego discovers it is not the center of the whole psyche. That discovery can feel like defeat. In ordinary language, the ego is often treated as arrogance. Someone has a big ego. Someone needs to get over themselves. But in Jungian psychology, the ego is not just vanity. It is the center of consciousness. It is the part of you that says I, chooses, remembers, compares, plans, and takes responsibility for the ordinary day. Without an ego, there is no stable human life. But with only an ego, there is no depth. This is where Jung's idea of the self enters. The self is not simply self-esteem, and it is not the polished personality we present to others. In Jungian language, the self is the deeper ordering center of the whole psyche, conscious and unconscious together. It is the larger pattern that the ego belongs to but does not control. Edinger's great gift was to make the relation between these two centers visible. He called attention to what became known as the ego-self axis, the living line of relation between the conscious ego and the deeper self. If that axis is alive, the ego can be small without being meaningless. It can suffer without being abandoned. It can make decisions while still feeling connected to a larger symbolic order. If that axis is broken, life can become strangely flat. The person may still be competent, they may still be admired, but inside there is alienation, a loss of contact with the source of meaning, energy, and inner authority. The ego is still driving, but the road no longer seems to lead anywhere. Edinger did not invent the self. Jung had already made it central to analytical psychology. But Edinger made one part of Jung's thought harder to ignore. Individuation is not the ego becoming more impressive. It is the ego slowly discovering its right relation to something larger than itself. That sounds noble when stated calmly. In real life, it is often humiliating. The ego begins life in a state of unconscious identity with the larger powers around it. A child does not first experience itself as a modest little island inside a vast psyche. The child lives inside a world where need, mother, body, fantasy, fear, and magic are not cleanly separated. Early on, the ego borrows a kind of divine importance from the self. The child's anger feels total. The child's desire feels absolute. The child's wound feels cosmic. This is not a moral failure. It is a developmental beginning, but adulthood requires separation. The ego has to learn that it is not God, not the whole, not the source of all meaning, not the secret ruler of reality. It has to become limited, responsible, and human. Here is the painful part. If separation from the self happens only as loss, the ego can become alienated. It no longer feels inflated with divine importance, but it also no longer feels held by any deeper center. It becomes practical, defended, maybe even successful, but spiritually homeless. That homelessness is one of Edinger's great subjects. He understood that many modern people do not suffer because they lack information. They suffer because the symbolic connection between ego and self has thinned out. They know how to manage their schedules, but not how to read their suffering. They know how to optimize their behavior, but not how to stand before a symbol that asks them to change. If this hidden architecture of Jungian psychology interests you, keep this channel close. Edinger is one of the thinkers who made Jung less decorative and much harder to avoid. His book Ego and Archetype carries a subtitle that matters: Individuation and the Religious Function of the Psyche. That phrase can sound old-fashioned now, especially to people who hear religion only as belief, institution, or doctrine. But Edinger was pointing to something more basic. The psyche has a religious function because the ego needs a relation to the whole. Not necessarily a church, not necessarily a creed, not necessarily any inherited theology, but some living relation to images, symbols, dreams, myths, values, and experiences that place the ego before something greater than itself. When that relation disappears, the ego often tries to replace it with achievement. It says, if I succeed enough, I will be whole. It says, if I am loved enough, I will be whole. It says, if I understand myself enough, I will be whole. But Edinger would warn that the ego cannot manufacture the self. It can only enter relation with it. This distinction changes the meaning of a crisis. Imagine a man in his early 40s who has built the life he was supposed to build. He has status, a careful routine, and a respectable story about who he is. Then, without a dramatic disaster, his inner world stops cooperating. Work feels empty. Marriage feels scripted. Success feels strangely embarrassing. He is not ill in any simple way, and he is not merely bored. His ego has reached the edge of the map it was using. A shallow culture may tell him to rebrand himself, find a new purpose, build a better routine, travel, start again, become the best version of himself. Some of that may help at the surface, but Edinger's question would be deeper. What larger center is now making a claim on this life? What symbol is trying to break through the old identity? What has the ego mistaken for the whole? This is where the midpoint of Edinger's map becomes uncomfortable. The collapse of meaning is not automatically growth. It can become bitterness. It can become grandiosity. It can become an addiction to spiritual language. It can become the fantasy that the ego is now special because it has suffered. The self is dangerous when the ego identifies with it. Inflation is the condition where the ego borrows the energy of the self and mistakes it for personal greatness. A person has a dream, a revelation, a psychological insight, or a powerful emotional experience, and suddenly ordinary humility feels beneath them. They do not say, I have encountered something larger. They say, I am the larger thing. That is not individuation. It is possession by significance. Edinger's psychology is useful because it does not flatter the ego in either direction. It does not say the ego is everything. It also does not say the ego should be destroyed. The ego must be strong enough to stand, humble enough to listen, and flexible enough to be reorganized. This is why Edinger returned again and again to religious and alchemical symbolism. He saw in those old images a language for psychic transformation that ordinary modern speech had lost. Alchemy, for example, is not important because modern people need to become medieval chemists. It is important because its images describe inner processes with astonishing precision: dissolution, burning, separation, death, purification, union, coagulation. These are not just strange words from old books. They are experiences of psychic change. Sometimes the ego has to be dissolved because its form has become too rigid. Sometimes it has to endure fire because illusion will not leave politely. Sometimes something valuable appears first as dark, shameful, or useless material. Sometimes the psyche has to separate what has been fused together before any real union is possible. Edinger's Anatomy of the Psyche develops this symbolic language. His work on Job, biblical images, and alchemy may seem far from ordinary modern life, but his underlying concern is close to the bone. How does consciousness survive an encounter with powers greater than itself? That is also why he matters after Jung. Jung opened the door to the self as a central archetype of order and wholeness. Edinger helped many readers see how the ego actually suffers its way toward that center. He made individuation less like an inspirational word and more like a sequence of dangerous negotiations. The ego must separate from unconscious identity with the self. Then it must suffer alienation. Then it must find symbolic relation again. But this reunion is not a return to childish inflation. It is not the fantasy that the universe secretly exists to confirm your importance. It is a more modest and more demanding connection. The ego remains an ego. The self remains larger. Between them, if the work goes well, there is a living axis. If you want the Jungian lineage beyond slogans, stay with this channel. The important part is not learning a new word for the self. It is noticing what your ego does when that center appears. There is a simple way to misunderstand Edinger. We can turn the ego-self axis into a diagram and imagine we have understood it because we can label the parts. Ego here, self there, axis between them. But the actual experience is not so tidy. The axis is felt when a dream changes the emotional temperature of the day. It is felt when a symbol will not leave you alone. It is felt when a failure becomes more instructive than a success. It is felt when guilt, grief, awe, or beauty interrupts the ego's private plan and forces a larger question. The axis is also felt negatively. It is felt in the deadness of a life cut off from symbolic meaning. It is felt in cynicism that once protected the ego, but now imprisons it. It is felt in the strange panic that arises when control no longer produces orientation. For Edinger, the point was not to escape ordinary life into symbols. The point was to let symbols return ordinary life to depth. A job is not only a job when it becomes the stage on which the ego learns service, pride, failure, vocation, or sacrifice. A relationship is not only a relationship when it reveals projection, dependence, devotion, fear, and the demand to become conscious. A crisis is not only a crisis when it exposes the collapse of an old center and the first trace of another one. This is the serious meaning of losing yourself. It does not mean becoming vague, passive, or mystical. It does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means that the ego loses its fantasy of being the whole personality. At first, that feels like diminishment. Later, it may feel like relief. The ego was never built to be the sun. It was built to carry a lamp. That lamp matters. Without it, the room remains dark. But the lamp does not create the whole room, and it does not own the center around which the room is arranged. This is where Edinger's work becomes quietly severe. He asks the modern person to give up two comforting fantasies at once. First, the fantasy that the ego can solve everything by becoming stronger, smarter, more productive, or more admired. Second, the fantasy that the ego can disappear into the self and be excused from the hard work of being human. Individuation requires neither ego worship nor ego murder. It requires relation. The adult who feels the center disappear may therefore be standing at the beginning of a more truthful life. Not because suffering is automatically wise, not because collapse is romantic, but because the old arrangement has stopped pretending to be the whole. Edinger gives us a language for that moment. Alienation is not the final truth. Inflation is not revelation. Despair is not proof that the self is absent. Often, despair is the ego's experience of losing a false center before it has learned how to relate to the real one. This is not medical advice, and it is not a promise that every crisis hides a secret gift. Some suffering needs practical help, protection, treatment, rest, and other people. Jungian language should never be used to decorate pain that needs care. But for the psychological and symbolic life, Edinger offers a hard mercy. He says, in effect, that the ego's defeat may be meaningful when it becomes the beginning of orientation. The person does not become whole by declaring themselves whole. They become more whole by learning how small they are without becoming worthless, by learning how large the psyche is without becoming possessed, by learning to stand in relation to the self without pretending to be the self. So the final image is not a throne. It is not a heroic figure standing above the world. It is a small desk in a quiet room. A book lies open. A circular mandala is drawn on a sheet of paper. Beside it, a lamp gives enough light to see the next line, but not enough to abolish the dark. That is the ego in Edinger's world. Not the king of the psyche, not the enemy of the soul. A necessary little light, learning at last where the center is.